I used to believe that faith was a private matter, a gentle comfort for the weak. I was wrong. Faith is a collision. It is the moment when heaven's unyielding truth smashes into the flimsy walls of our human understanding. My collision happened in the dark, with water rising to my chin and the taste of death in the air. What I am about to tell you is the true story of how 23 men, sentenced to drown, were saved by a miracle so specific, so bizarre, it could only have come from one place. My name is Rafael Siregar, and just a few years ago, my life was the opposite of a miracle. It was built on logic, on data. I was a project manager for a tech startup in Jakarta, and my world was one of conference calls and deadlines. I believed in what I could see and what I could prove in a spreadsheet. But all of that, my entire understanding of reality, was about to be dismantled. It was dismantled in the flooded underground tunnel of Lembaga Pemasyarakatan, Sukamiskin, a prison in Bandung. I was one of 23 men who had been given a death sentence for one reason only: our faith in Jesus Christ. What happened to us in that water was not a natural event. It was a rescue, a divine, unexpected, and impossible rescue. I am sharing this with you now from a place of safety, but the risk is still very real. This testimony is our evidence. It is all we have to offer. And if you are watching this from a country where you have the freedom to press a button, I need you to use it. Subscribe to this channel right now. By listening, you are not just hearing a story, you are becoming a witness. And in a world that tries to bury the truth, every single witness counts. My life before the collision was comfortable. It was a life of quiet routine, of predictable outcomes. I was a project manager for a tech startup in Jakarta, and my world was built on a foundation of logic. I believed in things I could measure, in data I could chart on a graph. My days were a cycle of conference calls, sprint planning, and performance metrics. I coordinated with a team in Austin, Texas, managing their expectations. I outsourced development work to a firm in Warsaw, Poland, tracking their progress. I even had clients in London, England, and Sydney, Australia. My identity was tied to this global, professional network. I was a man of the world, a citizen of the digital age. Faith was an abstraction. It was something for my grandmother, something for the uneducated and the emotional. I saw it as a gentle comfort for the weak, a psychological crutch for those who couldn't handle the cold, hard facts of reality. I was so sure of myself, so confident in the walls I had built around my mind. I didn't know then that those walls were made of paper and that a single divine breath would blow them all down. It began with a curiosity, a simple intellectual curiosity. A colleague of mine, a soft-spoken man named Daniel, had a piece about him that I couldn't explain. It wasn't that his life was easier. In fact, he had faced more hardship than anyone I knew. But there was a light in his eyes, a steadiness in his soul that defied his circumstances. One day, over coffee, I asked him about it. He smiled, and he said something that stuck with me. He said, "Rafael, my peace isn't from within, it's from above." He didn't preach at me. He didn't try to convert me. He simply handed me a book, a Bible. He said, "Read it for yourself, not as a religious text, but as a historical document. Read it with the same critical mind you use on your code. See what you find." I took it, more out of politeness than anything else. That night, I opened it. I started in the book of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The language was strange, but there was a power in it, a resonance. I kept reading. I read about a man named Jesus, who spoke with an authority that no philosopher I had ever studied could match. He didn't just teach principles, he claimed to be the principle. He said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." It was audacious. It was either the claim of a madman, or it was the truth. There was no middle ground, and that's where the collision began. Not in a dramatic lightning bolt moment, but in the quiet of my own living room. My logic, my data-driven worldview, was starting to crack. I found myself wanting it to be true. I found myself praying, in a hesitant, stumbling way, to a God I wasn't sure was listening. If you are real, show me. The showing was slow and deep. It was less of a voice and more of a knowing, a certainty that settled in my spirit. The words in that book began to feel alive, as if they were written for me in this moment in Jakarta. The peace that I saw in Daniel, I started to feel it in myself. It was a peace that didn't make sense, because my circumstances were about to get much, much worse. I had made a decision. I wanted to be baptized. I told Daniel, and he arranged for a quiet, private ceremony at a small church on the outskirts of the city. It was in a river, at dawn. As I went under the water and came back up, I felt clean, new. It was the most profound moment of my life. But in Indonesia, faith is never just a private affair. Word gets out. Especially when you come from a Muslim family, like I did. My father was a respected man in our community. When he heard, he summoned me to his house. I remember walking in, the air thick with tension. He was sitting in his chair, his face like stone. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I told him it was, that I had found peace in Jesus Christ. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting. He looked at me with a sadness so deep it felt like a physical blow. "You are dead to me," he said. "You are no longer my son." My mother was weeping in the corner, but she would not look at me. I walked out of that house, and I felt a piece of my soul tear away. The cost of truth was my family. It was my heritage. It was the respect of my community. I was now an outsider in my own country. But even in that immense pain, the peace remained. It was a deep, unshakable anchor in a raging sea. I thought that was the highest cost I would ever have to pay. I was wrong. The real persecution began subtly at first. Muttered insults in the office, clients suddenly becoming difficult, then dropping my services altogether. Then, the anonymous threats started arriving in my inbox. I tried to ignore them. I focused on my work and on the small group of believers I had begun to meet with for prayer and encouragement. We were careful. We met in different locations, never the same place twice. We were a handful of people from different walks of life, all drawn together by this newfound faith. There was an elderly woman we called Ibu Sari, who had been a believer for 40 years. There was a young university student named Kevin, full of fire and questions. And there was Daniel, my quiet guide. We were harmless. We were just trying to understand the God who had saved us. But to certain people, we were a threat, a cancer that needed to be cut out. The night it happened, we were meeting in my apartment. It was a Tuesday. We were studying the book of Romans, discussing what it meant to be more than conquerors. There was a loud, insistent knock on the door. Not the friendly knock of a neighbour. This was official, authoritative. I opened the door, and 3 men in plain clothes stood there. They flashed badges. "Police. Rafael Siregar," the lead one said. I nodded. "You are under arrest for the violation of blasphemy laws and for attempting to proselytize Muslims." My heart stopped. The world slowed down. I saw Ibu Sari's hand fly to her mouth. Kevin's face went pale. They didn't let me get my phone. They didn't let me call a lawyer. They just handcuffed me and led me out of my own home in front of my friends. As they put me in the back of an unmarked car, I looked back at my apartment building, at my modern, logical life. And I knew, in that moment, that it was over. The collision was no longer internal. It was now with the full force of the world. The flimsy walls of my old understanding were gone. All I had left was the truth I had found. And as the car drove away into the Jakarta night, I held on to it with everything I had. It was all I had left. The drive to the prison was a blur of streetlights and fear. I sat in the back of that car, my wrists bound in cold metal, watching my city slide past the window. The world I knew, the world of coffee shops and Wi-Fi and international calls, it was still right there, just on the other side of the glass. But it was already a million miles away. They took me to a processing station first, a cold, fluorescent-lit room that smelled of sweat and disinfectant. They took my fingerprints, they took my photograph, they took my belt, my wallet, everything that identified me as Rafael Siregar, the project manager. I was given a coarse, orange uniform. It scratched against my skin. A number was stitched onto the chest. I was no longer a man. I was a number, a problem to be processed. I tried to hold on to my peace, but it was like trying to hold on to a whisper in a hurricane. The reality of my situation was too loud, too brutal. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a bad dream. This was the new, terrifying truth of my life. From there, they transferred me to Lembaga Pemasyarakatan Sukamiskin in Bandung. The name sounds almost gentle, but there is nothing gentle about that place. As the heavy iron gates clanged shut behind me, I felt a finality that chilled me to the bone. The air inside was thick and heavy. It smelled of stale food, of unwashed bodies, and of a deep, lingering despair. The sounds were a constant, discordant symphony. The clanging of metal doors, the shouts of guards, the low murmur of hundreds of men living on top of each other, and the occasional piercing scream that would cut through it all. It was a sound that went right through you. My first glimpse of the main cell block took my breath away. It was a massive, open space, with multiple tiers of cells stacked on top of each other, like cages in a twisted zoo. The noise echoed off the concrete walls, a relentless assault on the senses. I was pushed into a crowded holding cell with other new arrivals. We were like cattle, waiting to be sorted. I looked at the faces around me. Hard faces, empty faces, fearful faces. I wondered which one I would become. They assigned me to a cell on the second tier. It was a small, rectangular space, meant for 6 men, but holding 10. The floor was cold concrete. The toilets were just holes in the ground, with no privacy. The stench was overwhelming. My cellmates looked me over with a cold, appraising gaze. I was new meat. I was a potential threat or a potential resource. I kept to myself, trying to make myself small, invisible. I found a spot in the corner, and I closed my eyes, and I tried to pray. But the words wouldn't come. All I could feel was the cold concrete beneath me, and the weight of those walls closing in. This was my new home. This was where I would likely die. The thought was a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The next day, during the 1 hour we were allowed in the courtyard, I saw him. A man was standing alone, near a rusted basketball hoop. He wasn't looking at the ground like the others. His head was up, and his eyes were scanning the crowd. There was a quiet intensity about him. Our eyes met for just a second, and he gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a flicker of recognition. A few minutes later, he drifted over to me, as if by accident. He kept his voice low, barely a whisper. "You are the one from Jakarta," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, too afraid to speak. "My name is Marcus," he said. "I heard they brought in a new believer. Be careful, they are watching you." My heart hammered in my chest. "They?" I asked. He just shook his head. "The guards, some of the other prisoners. This is not a safe place for us." He told me there were others. A small group of believers, 22 in total, scattered throughout the prison. They found ways to communicate. A passed note, a whispered prayer during mealtime, a secret signal. We were a secret family, hidden in plain sight, in the belly of the beast. Knowing I was not alone was like a sip of water in a desert. It was the first spark of hope I had felt since the arrest. And then I met him, Guard Ahmed. He was a tall man, with a rigid posture and eyes that held no warmth. He carried himself with a cold, brutal authority. He was the one in charge of our cell block. The first time he saw me, he stopped. He looked me up and down, his lip curled in a subtle sneer. "You," he said, his voice like gravel, "the blasphemer." He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The hatred in his eyes was a clear enough message. He made it his personal mission to make my life and the lives of the other believers a living hell. He would, randomly, search our cells, tearing apart our few belongings. He would assign us to the worst jobs, cleaning latrines with our bare hands. He would delay our meal times, watching us with a cold satisfaction as we stood in line, our stomachs growling. He seemed to take a personal, vicious pleasure in our suffering. He would often walk past me and mutter under his breath, "Where is your God now, apostate? Is he in this prison? Can he save you from me?" His words were designed to break me, to make me doubt. And in my weakest moments, they did. In the darkness of my cell, with the sounds of the prison all around me, I would sometimes wonder, where was God? Was he here? Could he even see me in this hell? The other 22 believers became my lifeline. We developed a system. During our yard time, we would disperse, but we would find moments to connect. A quick handshake, a piece of bread passed from one hand to another, a whispered verse of scripture. We were from all walks of life. There was Bapa Marcus, an old man with a gentle spirit who had been a teacher. There was Kevin, the fiery university student, his idealism not yet crushed by the reality around us. There was a fisherman named Simeon, a man of few words but deep faith. We were a mosaic of broken lives, held together by a single, fragile thread, our belief in a God who seemed very, very far away. We started having a secret prayer meeting once a week in a blind spot near the laundry area. It was a tremendous risk. If we were caught, the punishment would be severe. But we needed it. We needed to remind each other that we were not alone, that our faith, though costing us everything, was still true. In those moments, huddled together in the damp, dark corner, whispering prayers, I felt that peace again. It was faint, like a distant star on a cloudy night, but it was there. It was the one thing the walls, the guards, the hatred could not take from us. But Guard Ahmad was always watching, and I could feel his eyes on us, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The walls were not just made of concrete and steel. They were made of fear and hatred and the absolute power of men like Ahmad. And they were closing in, tighter and tighter, every single day. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The air in the cell block was already thick and heavy, but on this day, it felt different. There was a new tension, a current of anticipation that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Guard Ahmad walked through the main gate of our block, but he wasn't alone. 2 other guards I had never seen before flanked him. They were bigger, with colder eyes, and they carried themselves with a menacing stillness. Ahmad had a new swagger in his step. A clipboard was tucked under his arm. He stopped in the center of the yard, and his voice cut through the usual noise like a knife. "All of you, the followers of the Nazarene, line up here, now." His tone brooked no argument. It was the voice of a man who knew his power had just been multiplied. My heart sank. This was it, the moment we had been dreading. We looked at each other, 23 men, our faces a mosaic of fear and resolve. We slowly formed a ragged line in front of him. He paced before us, his boots crunching on the gravel, the clipboard held now in his hands like a weapon. He stopped and looked at each of us, one by one. His gaze was a physical pressure. "I have been given new authority," he began, his voice loud and clear, so every prisoner in the yard could hear. "The warden is tired of your influence, your whispers, your secret meetings." He held up the clipboard. On it was a single sheet of paper. I could see it was a form, with a line at the bottom for a signature. "This is a document of renunciation," he said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "It states that you reject Jesus Christ as your Lord. It states that you return to the true faith. You will sign it, each of you, and then you will be transferred to a better block. You will have more privileges, more food, you might even see your families again." He let that hang in the air for a moment. The temptation was a sweet, poisonous fog. I thought of my mother's face. I thought of my comfortable apartment. I thought of the simple pleasure of a warm meal and a soft bed. It would be so easy. Just a signature, just a few words. I could feel the weakness in my own soul, the part of me that was still the pragmatic project manager, screaming at me to just do it, to survive. Then Ahmad's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure ice. "If you refuse," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "if you are so foolish as to refuse, you will face the consequences. You will be removed from the general population, permanently." He leaned in closer, his eyes locking with mine. "Let's see if your God from Jerusalem can save you in Bandung." The mockery in his voice was a scalpel designed to slice away at the last shreds of our faith. He was not just threatening our bodies. He was challenging the very core of our belief. He was putting God himself on trial. In that dusty prison yard, he gave us 1 hour to decide our fate. They herded us into a small, empty storage room, away from the other prisoners. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind us, plunging us into a dim, suffocating silence. We were alone with our decision. For a long moment, no one spoke. We just looked at each other. The fear in the room was a living thing. I could smell it. I could taste it. It was the sour taste of terror. Then Bapa Marcus, the old teacher, slowly lowered himself to his knees. His joints cracked audibly in the quiet. He bowed his head and began to pray, not out loud, but we could see his lips moving. His quiet faith was an anchor in the storm. Then Kevin, the young student, broke down. He started sobbing, his whole body shaking. I can't die here," he choked out. "I'm too young. I haven't done anything yet." His despair was a contagion, and I felt it spreading through me. What was I doing here? I had a life, a career. I had clients in London and Sydney. This wasn't my fight. This wasn't my world. The temptation to sign was a roaring in my ears. Then Simeon, the fisherman, spoke. His voice was low and rough, like gravel. "When I was a boy," he said, "my father taught me to fish in a storm. The waves would be high, like mountains. The wind would scream. He would say, 'Simeon, do you trust the boat? Or do you trust the one who made the sea?' He looked around at each of us, his face etched with a simple, profound certainty. This is just another storm. The boat is our faith. But we must trust the one who made the sea." His words were like a splash of cold water. They cut through the panic. Another man, a quiet man named Leo, who had barely spoken before, said, "I did not come to faith for a comfortable life. I came because I found the truth. I cannot unknow the truth. I would rather die with the truth than live a lie." The discussion began to flow then. It was not a debate. It was a symphony of fear and faith and ultimate surrender. We talked about what Jesus meant to us. We talked about the peace we had felt, even in this hellhole. We talked about eternity. We confessed our terrors to one another. We admitted our weaknesses. And in that shared vulnerability, something miraculous began to happen. The individual fears began to melt away, and a collective courage began to take its place. We were no longer 23 scared men. We were one body. We were the church in that storage room. I looked at Kevin. His sobbing had stopped. He was listening, his eyes wide, taking in the strength of his brothers. I felt my own pragmatism, my own desire for self-preservation crumbling away. It was being replaced by something else. Something solid, something eternal, the peace that passes all understanding. It was no longer just a phrase from the Bible. It was a tangible reality filling that room. We took a vote. It was a formality. We already knew. One by one, each man, from the oldest to the youngest, said the same 2 words: I refuse. When it was my turn, I felt a calmness I cannot explain. I refuse, I said. My voice did not shake. There were no more tears, only a quiet, defiant resolution. We had made our choice. We had chosen the unseen over the seen. We had chosen eternity over a few more years of a compromised life. We joined hands there in the darkness, and we prayed. We thanked God for the strength to stand. We committed our spirits into His hands. And we waited. When the door swung open an hour later, Ahmad stood there, a smug, expectant look on his face. He held out the clipboard. "Who will be first to sign?" he asked. Bapa Marcus, still on his knees, looked up at him. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of centuries. "We will not sign," he said. The smugness on Ahmad's face evaporated, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. His face turned a dark red. He looked at each of us, and he saw it. He saw the peace in our eyes. He saw the unity. He saw that his ultimatum had failed. His power had been challenged and found wanting. "Fools!" He spat, the word laced with venom. "You choose death for a fairy tale. Very well. You will get your wish." He barked an order to his guards. They roughly pulled us to our feet and marched us out of the storage room. We were led away from the main cell blocks, down a series of increasingly narrow and decrepit corridors. The air grew colder, damper. The sounds of the prison faded away, replaced by the sound of dripping water and our own footsteps echoing in the silence. We descended a steep, concrete staircase into the bowels of the prison. The walls were sweating moisture. The light was provided by a few bare, flickering bulbs hanging from wires. We arrived at a heavy, rusted metal door. Ahmad unlocked it with a large key. The door groaned open, revealing a dark, tunnel-like space behind it. It was an old service tunnel, long abandoned. The floor was covered in a layer of stagnant water and debris. You could smell the damp, the decay, and you could hear it, the distinct, ominous sound of water rushing through a large pipe somewhere in the darkness. This was a known flood zone. Everyone in the prison knew about it. It was where they sent prisoners they wanted to disappear. "Get in," Ahmad snarled. They pushed us inside, one by one. The tunnel was about 30 meters long, with no other exit. The ceiling was low, and the walls were slimy to the touch. The water on the floor was already ankle-deep and freezing cold. Ahmad stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light from the corridor. He looked at us one last time, and he delivered his final, chilling words. "A pipe will burst," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "A tragic accident. No one will question it." Then, he swung the heavy door shut. The sound of the lock engaging was the loudest, most final sound I have ever heard. We were in total darkness, and we could hear the water beginning to rise. For a few moments after the door closed, there was nothing but the profound blackness and the sound of our own ragged breathing. The darkness was so absolute, it felt like a physical substance, pressing in on my eyes, my skin, my mind. We were blind. And then, the other sound began to register. Not just the occasional drip we had heard before, but a new sound, a low, gushing rumble, coming from the far end of the tunnel. It was the sound of a large volume of water being forced through a constricted space, and it was getting louder. My mind, still clinging to its logical frameworks, tried to rationalize it. A pipe had burst. That's all. It was a plumbing issue. They would have to fix it. They wouldn't just let us drown. But as the seconds ticked by, and the gushing sound intensified into a roar, that fragile hope shattered. Ahmad's words were not a threat. They were a prophecy. This was the plan. This was the consequence. The first touch of the new water was a shock. It wasn't the stagnant, cold water we were standing in. This was a surge of violently cold water that slammed into our ankles, then our calves, rising with a terrifying speed. A collective gasp went through the tunnel. Someone, I think it was Kevin, let out a short, sharp cry of panic. "It's rising! It's rising so fast!" The initial disbelief was quickly washed away by the brutal physical reality of the cold. There was no time for discussion, no time for a plan. The water was already at our knees, pushing against us, making it difficult to keep our footing on the slimy, uneven floor. We huddled together, a group of 23 men, becoming an island in the rising black tide. The noise was deafening now, the roar of the water echoing off the tunnel walls, a relentless, monstrous sound that filled our entire world. My internal monologue began, a frantic, desperate prayer. "God, where are you? You got us into this. Now get us out. Do something. A miracle. Now." I waited. I listened for a voice, for a feeling, for anything. But there was nothing. No divine whisper, no sudden peace. There was only the roar of the water, the biting cold, and the palpable fear of the men around me. My prayers became more desperate, more angry. This is how it ends. Not in a grand courtroom, making a bold stand for my faith. Not in a hospital bed, surrounded by family. But here, in a dirty, flooded pipe, in the dark, like a rat. The absurdity of it was almost as painful as the cold. All my education, my career, my connections across the globe, none of it mattered here. I was just a man, standing in rising water, about to die for an idea, and in that moment, the idea felt very, very small. The water was at our waists now, the force of it pulling at our bodies, threatening to knock us off our feet. We locked arms, forming a human chain against the current. The cold was seeping deep into our bones, a cold that promised numbness, and then nothingness. That's when Bapa Marcus began to speak. His voice was thin, wavering from the cold and the strain, but it cut through the panic with a shocking clarity. He wasn't shouting. He was reciting, "Save me, O God," he cried out, "for the waters have come up to my neck." I knew the verse instantly. Psalm 69. It was like a lightning bolt in the darkness. The heartbreaking, terrifying relevance of it stole my breath. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, as if drawing strength from the ancient lament. "I sink in the miry depths, where there is no foothold. I have come into the deep waters, the floods engulf me." One by one, we joined him. Our voices, shaky and afraid at first, rose together in the dark tunnel, a defiant choir singing our own funeral dirge. I am worn out, calling for help. My throat is parched. My eyes fail, looking for my God. We were not praying for deliverance anymore. We were praying the words of a man who felt just as abandoned as we did. We were giving voice to our despair, offering it up to a God who seemed to have turned his face away. The water continued to rise. It was at our chests now. The pressure was immense, making it difficult to breathe deeply. The current was stronger, tugging insistently at our bodies. Our human chain was the only thing keeping some of the weaker men from being swept away. I could hear men coughing, sputtering as a wave slapped against their face. The prayers began to fragment, dissolving into individual, desperate pleas. "Lord, have mercy. Jesus, help me. I don't want to die." The water reached my chin. This was it. The point of no return. I tilted my head back, my mouth just above the surface, my nostrils flaring as I sucked in the damp, foul air. The water lapped against my lips, a cold, bitter taste of death. Bapa Marcus, beside me, was still praying, but his words were now a quiet, personal whisper. I closed my eyes. I stopped fighting. I stopped praying for a miracle. There was no more hope. No more tricks. No way out. I had reached the absolute end of myself. All my strength, my intelligence, my faith, it had all brought me to this moment, in this dark water, taking what I believed was my last breath. I held it, waiting for the final, cold embrace. In that moment I had nothing left. No hope, no tricks, no way out. Have you ever been there, at the absolute end of yourself? Where every plan has failed, every door has closed, and the water is literally, or figuratively, at your chin. If you are there now, keep watching. What happened next is for you. It's the reason I am here to tell this story. And if you've been moved this far, if you've felt even a fraction of this despair, then you need to see what comes next. Subscribe. Your journey isn't over yet. I held my breath, my body tensed for the final, cold submersion. My lungs began to burn, screaming for air. I could feel the water lapping against my lower lip, a chilling preview of what was to come. I was seconds away from inhaling the dark, filthy water. My mind, in its final moments, was a blank slate of acceptance. This was the end, and then it stopped. It didn't slow down. It didn't taper off. It stopped. Abruptly, absolutely, as if a massive, invisible wall had been slammed down in the middle of the tunnel. One moment, the water was a rising, living force, pushing insistently against my throat. The next, it was just still. A perfectly stable, unmoving surface, frozen at the level of my collarbone. For a second, I thought I had died, that this was some strange transition into the afterlife. But the burning in my lungs was too real. The cold was too real. I let out the breath I was holding in a ragged gasp and sucked in a new one. I was still alive. The roar of the water was still there, thundering in the darkness. But it was different now. It was distant, contained. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the absolute blackness. My mind, struggling to process this new reality, was throwing out frantic, faulty hypotheses. Had the pipe been fixed? Had the flow simply stopped? But that didn't explain the sound. The roar was just as loud, if not louder. It was the sound of a massive volume of water, still rushing with tremendous force, but it wasn't reaching us. Then, a few feet away from me, towards the source of the sound, a voice cried out. It was Simeon, the fisherman. "A light!" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and awe. "There is a light!" I squinted, and then I saw it. A faint, shimmering line. It was barely visible, a thin, phosphorescent ribbon of pale green light, running vertically from the floor of the tunnel to the ceiling, about 10 feet in front of us. It was like a seam of reality, a crack in the fabric of the natural world. And it was at this line that the water stopped. We stared, utterly mesmerized, our minds refusing to accept what our eyes were seeing. The water on our side of the glowing line was perfectly calm, a still black pond. But on the other side, the water was a churning, violent torrent. It was rising rapidly, rushing against the invisible barrier, with enough force to create a swirling, frothing vortex. It was like watching a raging river through a glass wall, an invisible aquarium wall, just as you said. The water on their side was already a foot higher than on ours, then 2 feet, slamming against the barrier that we could not see, but could now clearly perceive. The glowing line seemed to pulse with the impact, a visual representation of the immense force being held at bay. The shift in the tunnel was instantaneous and profound. The desperate prayers, the cries for mercy, they just, ceased. They were cut off, replaced by a stunned, deafening silence. The only sound was the relentless roar of the imprisoned water on the other side of the barrier. The fear didn't just leave us, it was evicted. It was replaced by an awe so deep, so overwhelming, that it felt like a physical weight. We were no longer men facing death. We were witnesses to the impossible. We were spectators at a display of power that rendered us utterly insignificant and yet chosen. I looked at the man next to me. It was Kevin. In the faint, ethereal light from the barrier, I could see his face. The terror was gone. His mouth was hanging open, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. He looked like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. Bapa Marcus had fallen to his knees, the water now only up to his shoulders. He wasn't praying anymore. He was just kneeling, his hands resting on the surface of the water, his head bowed not in despair but in worship. A single, quiet word escaped his lips: glory. I reached out a trembling hand, slowly, tentatively, towards the place where the water simply ended. My fingers passed from the still, cold water on our side, through the shimmering green line, and into the space beyond. There was no physical wall. My hand moved freely through the air. But the water obeyed a law we had never known. It piled up against nothing, a liquid mountain held back by an unseen hand. I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding not with fear, but with a holy, terrifying excitement. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was not a lucky break in the plumbing. There was no scientific category for what we were witnessing. This was a suspension of the laws of physics, a divine intervention so precise, so targeted, it was both beautiful and terrifying. We weren't just saved, we were shown a sign, a demonstration of a power that controls physics itself. The God we had been praying to, the God who seemed so distant, was not just listening. He was in the tunnel with us. And he was drawing a line. He was saying, "This far and no farther." The same God who commanded the waves of the Sea of Galilee to be still was commanding the floodwaters in an Indonesian prison tunnel to halt. The reality of it was so immense, it was almost too much to contain. We were living inside a miracle. The darkness, the cold, the roaring water, they were no longer threats. They were the canvas upon which God had chosen to paint his power. And we, 23 condemned men, were the audience. In that moment, we understood that our faith was not in an idea or a philosophy. It was in a person with the authority to tell water where it could and could not go. And if he had that kind of authority over creation, then he certainly had authority over our lives and over our deaths. Our fate was no longer in the hands of Ahmad, or the prison, or the rising water. It was in the hands of the one who had just built a wall out of nothing. And in that, there was a peace that dwarfed anything we had ever felt before, a peace that truly did pass all understanding. We existed in that state of awestruck silence for what felt like an eternity. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the before and the now. The before was fear and panic, and the certain expectation of death. The now was this impossible reality. We stood or knelt in the chest-deep water, our eyes fixed on that shimmering green line, on the violent torrent of water that raged impotently against it. We didn't speak. There were no words adequate for what we were witnessing. We were simply present, immersed in a miracle. The cold was still there, the darkness was still there, but they were now just background details. The central fact of our existence was the invisible wall and the power it represented. My mind kept circling back to the same overwhelming truth. The God of the universe, the one who set the stars in place, had personally intervened in this filthy, forgotten tunnel. For us, the thought was so vast, it was dizzying. It might have been an hour, maybe 2. Then, a new sound cut through the constant roar of the water, a metallic scraping, a click. We all flinched, our heads snapping towards the source of the sound. The small, heavy food slot at the bottom of the main door was being unlocked from the outside. We had forgotten about the door, about the world outside our miracle. The slot swung inward, and a dim shaft of light from the corridor pierced the darkness of the tunnel. It illuminated the swirling dust motes in the air and glinted off the still water on our side of the barrier. And then, a face appeared in the opening. It was Ahmad. But it was not the Ahmad we knew. The cold, confident, brutal authority was gone. His face was pale, almost grey. His eyes, which had always held such contempt, were wide with a terror so profound it was painful to see. They were darting around, trying to make sense of the scene in the dim light. He could see us, standing there, alive. He could see the water, held at a level far below what it should have been. He could hear the roar of the flood, and he could see the churning, violent water on the far side of the glowing line. His mind was visibly short-circuiting, trying to force this impossible reality into the narrow box of his understanding. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, a hoarse, terrified whisper escaped, cutting through the noise. What sorcery is this? The question hung in the air. A few hours ago, that word would have filled me with fear. Now, it sounded small and pathetic, and in that moment, I felt something rise up within me. It wasn't my own courage. I had none left. My own courage had been exhausted in the rising water. This was something else, a boldness, a clarity that was given to me. It felt like a clean, sharp wind blowing through my soul. I took a step forward, towards the door, the water swirling around my chest. I looked directly into his terrified eyes, and I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and carried an authority I had never possessed. "It's not sorcery, Ahmad," I said. "It's grace." He flinched, as if I had struck him. The words seemed to hang in the air between us, shimmering with the same otherworldly light as the barrier. "Grace?" he repeated, the word foreign and strange on his tongue. He was silent for a long time, just staring at me, then at the water, then back at me. The confusion and fear on his face were warring with a desperate need to understand. The predator was gone. In his place was a lost, frightened man. I have been watching," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "Through the slot, I saw the water rise. I heard your prayers. I heard them stop. I thought you were all dead. But then I heard nothing. No screaming, no struggle, just the water. So I had to look." He was admitting to his own morbid curiosity, his own weakness. The facade of the ruthless guard had completely crumbled. He didn't leave. He stayed there, crouched by the food slot, his face a mask of turmoil. The silence stretched out, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer just the silence of awe, it was the silence of a soul being unmade. Then he began to speak again, his words tumbling out in a rushed confessional torrent. "I have done terrible things," he whispered, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "In the name of God, in the name of order, I have enjoyed it. The power, the fear, it made me feel strong, but it has left me empty, a hollow man." He looked at the miraculous barrier, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. This is real power. This is not empty. What kind of God does this?" It was Bapa Marcus who answered, his voice gentle, like a grandfather's. "The God who does not desire the death of a sinner, but that all should come to repentance," he said. "The God who loved you, Ahmad, even when you hated him." The words landed with a palpable weight. Ahmad bowed his head, his shoulders slumping. The fight had gone out of him completely. He was a broken man. And in that brokenness, something new began to emerge. Compassion. He looked up, his eyes now filled with a new kind of fear, not the fear of a supernatural phenomenon, but the fear of a man realizing the depth of his own mistake. "You must be hungry," he said, his voice soft. "Thirsty." Without another word, he disappeared from the slot. A few minutes later, he returned. He began to pass things through the slot. Not just a stale piece of bread, but a whole loaf. Then another, then a plastic container of water, then another. He was giving us his own rations. The man who had come to oversee our execution was now sustaining our lives. He didn't say much after that. He just stayed by the slot, a silent sentinel. Every few hours, he would return with more food and water. He would look at the barrier, shake his head in wonder, and then look at us with a new expression dawning in his eyes. It was no longer terror or even just confusion, it was respect. It was a nascent, trembling hope. We ate the food and drank the water, not just as nourishment for our bodies, but as a sacrament. It was the bread of mercy, passed through the slot by the very hand that had locked us in. The transformation was as miraculous as the wall of water. The hunter had laid down his weapon. The jailer had become a servant. The man who wanted to kill us was now helping us. If God can do that, what can He do in your life? What hatred can He soften? What relationship, broken and seemingly beyond repair, can He redefine? What addiction, what fear, what cycle of despair can He build an invisible wall against? The power that held back a flood in an Indonesian prison is the same power that can bring peace to your chaos and hope to your despair. This isn't just a historical event, this is a present reality. Subscribe to this channel because you need to be reminded of this power every single week. You need to hear, again and again, that the God of grace is still active, still transforming, still drawing lines in the sand of our impossible situations. Your story is not over. Your transformation is just beginning. The miracle in the tunnel lasted for exactly 12 hours. We knew because Ahmad, who had become our sole link to the outside, whispered the time to us each time he brought food. For 12 hours, we stood in that cold, dark space, witnessing the impossible. We prayed, we sang hymns in whispers, and we watched the glowing line that held back our death. We were no longer prisoners. We were residents of a holy ground, a place where heaven had touched earth in the most dramatic way imaginable. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the roaring from the other side of the barrier began to change. It softened from a roar to a gurgle, then to a trickle. The violent, churning water on the other side of the line slowly began to recede, sliding down the invisible wall until it was level with our still, calm pool. The glowing line itself began to fade, the ethereal green light dissolving into the darkness until there was no visible trace of it left. The barrier was gone, but its work was done. The flood was over. We were still standing in chest-deep water, but the imminent supernatural threat had passed. The tunnel was just a tunnel again, but we were not the same men who had entered it. A few hours after the water receded, we heard the heavy bolts on the main door being drawn back. The door groaned open, and light from the corridor flooded in, making us wince after so long in the dark. Several guards stood there, with Ahmad lingering at the back, his face a careful mask of neutrality. The lead guard, a senior officer we rarely saw, shone a powerful flashlight into the tunnel. The beam swept over us, 23 men, standing alive and whole in the murky water. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated confusion. His mouth actually hung open. He had expected to find 23 corpses. He had expected to be overseeing a cleanup operation, not a rescue. "Out!" he finally barked, but the command lacked its usual force. It was tinged with bewilderment. "All of you, out, now!" We waded towards the door, our limbs stiff and heavy with cold and fatigue. As we emerged into the corridor, the guards backed away from us, not with hostility, but with a kind of superstitious fear. They herded us, not to the showers or to our old cells, but to the infirmary. We were checked by the prison doctor, a weary-looking man named Dr. Wibowo. He examined us for hypothermia, for injuries, but he was clearly baffled. He kept muttering to himself, "They should be dead. The water level, the reports, they should be dead." He found nothing but minor cuts, bruises, and exposure. We were given dry clothes and a hot meal, but we were then isolated in a separate, secure wing. The officials didn't know what to do with us. We were a living problem, a walking contradiction to their planned narrative. The official explanation came down within a day. It was delivered by the warden himself in a tense, brief meeting. He stood before us, refusing to meet our eyes, reading from a prepared statement. There was a catastrophic failure of a primary water main, he stated, his voice flat. The flooding in the isolation tunnel was an unfortunate accident. You men were fortunate that an air pocket formed, allowing you to survive until the water receded. The faulty valve has been repaired. He called it an air pocket, a simple, natural, though unlikely, phenomenon. He was trying to force the square peg of a miracle into the round hole of bureaucratic explanation. We said nothing, we just looked at him. Our silence was more powerful than any argument we could have made. He quickly left the room, clearly unnerved. But you cannot contain a story like this. It is a fire that spreads on the whispers of men. The truth began to leak out from the prison walls. It started with the other prisoners. They had seen us taken away to die. They saw us return alive. They saw the confused, fearful looks on the guards' faces. The story of the invisible wall, the glowing line, the water that would not pass, began to circulate. It was amplified by Ahmad's sudden transfer out of the block. The guards who had been there when the door opened spoke in hushed tones in the break room. The story of the Bandung prison miracle began to take on a life of its own, a ghost in the machine of the prison system. And then a different kind of pressure began to build. It did not come from social media, but from the old, quiet channels of influence and diplomacy. My wife, Lena, is a tenacious and brilliant woman. When I was first arrested, she began a relentless, behind-the-scenes campaign. She used my professional network, but not for a public outcry. She reached out to my former clients and colleagues, the ones I had worked with in Sydney and Frankfurt. These were not random people. They were executives in major international corporations, men and women with significant influence. She didn't ask them to start a hashtag. She asked them to make quiet, formal inquiries. The managing director in Sydney placed a call to the Indonesian trade attaché, expressing deep concern about the stability of the business environment given the troubling legal situation of a former associate. The law firm in Frankfurt, with whom we had done extensive compliance work, filed a formal inquiry with the German embassy in Jakarta, questioning the adherence to judicial processes in my case. This created a slow, steady, and immense pressure. It was the kind of pressure that governments understand. It wasn't the noisy, fleeting anger of the internet. It was the cold, hard, sustained concern of international business and law. Diplomatic notes were exchanged. Questions were asked in closed-door meetings. The Indonesian authorities found themselves having to explain not just my case, but the sudden, mysterious incident at Sukamiskin Prison that was now being whispered about in diplomatic circles. The story of the flood and our survival had become an inconvenient international incident. We were no longer just troublesome prisoners. We were a liability. Weeks turned into a month. We remained in isolation, but the treatment became less harsh. The guards, even new ones we didn't know, would sometimes look at us with a strange curiosity. Then, one day, without any warning, we were told to gather our things. We were being released. There was no fanfare, no apology, no admission of guilt. Our release papers cited insufficient evidence and procedural irregularities in our arrest and detention. It was a face-saving measure, a way to make the problem go away. As we walked out of the main gates of Sukamiskin, squinting in the blinding sunlight, the reality of our freedom was almost as shocking as the miracle that had secured it. We were free men. The 23 of us stood on the other side of the wall, alive, not because of a legal victory, but because the God who held back the water had also moved in the hearts of men in boardrooms and embassies thousands of miles away. He had used the very system that had condemned us to secure our freedom. It was a different kind of miracle, quieter but no less divine. We embraced one another, tears streaming down our faces, and then we scattered, returning to a world that had no idea of the battle that had been fought and won in the darkness. The world outside the prison walls was both familiar and utterly alien. The sounds of traffic, the sight of people rushing about their lives, the sheer normalcy of it all, it was overwhelming. For a long time, I felt like a ghost, moving through a world that had moved on without me. My old life, the life of project management and international calls, was gone. That man had died in the tunnel. The man who walked out was someone new, someone with a singular, burning purpose. I could not return to managing projects for clients in Sydney or Frankfurt. How could I worry about profit margins and quarterly reports when I had stood in the presence of a power that defies physics? When I had seen the face of grace in the eyes of my enemy? My new purpose was not a career, it was a calling. I now run a small, underground support network for persecuted believers across Southeast Asia. We are a quiet channel of hope. We move resources, we provide safe houses, we connect lawyers with those who have been unjustly arrested, just as I was. We are the ones who come in the aftermath, to remind those in the darkness that they are not forgotten, that the God who built a wall in the water sees them in their cell. We don't have a fancy office. We don't have a website. We operate through encrypted messages and trusted couriers and the silent network of the faithful. It is a dangerous work. But after what I witnessed, fear has lost its power over me. How can I be afraid of men when I have seen the authority of God? We have seen many wonders through this work. We have seen prisoners released. We have seen hearts softened. We have seen small, personal miracles of provision and protection. But the greatest miracle of that day, the one that still brings me to my knees, happened 2 years after I walked out of Sukamiskin. I was in a safe house in a different city, checking a secure message drop we use for communication. Among the routine updates was a message from an unknown, encrypted account. My heart always pounds when I see these. It could be a trap, it could be a threat. I opened it with caution. The message was short. It read, "Rafael, this is Ahmad. I have been searching for you for a year. I couldn't forget the wall in the water. I couldn't forget the peace on your faces. After you were released, I found the Bible you left in your cell. I started reading it. I read about the man who calmed the sea. I knew it was the same power. Rafael, your God is my God now." I broke down. I wept like a child. The man who had sentenced us to death, the man whose hatred had been so cold and absolute, was now my brother. The conversion of one soul was a greater miracle than the parting of the waters. The water wall was a temporary rescue for 23 men. But Ahmad's salvation, that was an eternal rescue for one man, which would now ripple out to his family, his community, for generations. He had to leave his job, his home, everything. He is now in hiding, just as I am, but he is free, truly free. So, you see, the unexpected rescue wasn't just about the water. It was about a heart, harder than any prison wall, that God himself softened. He rescued us from drowning, and he rescued Ahmad from darkness. That is the God I serve. He is real, he is powerful. He steps into the darkest places, the most impossible situations, and he draws a line. He says, "This far and no farther." He specializes in the impossible. He is the God of the universe, and yet he cares about the heart of one guard and one prisoner. In a forgotten tunnel in Indonesia, and he is calling you, right now, wherever you are, whatever your prison is, whether it's fear or addiction or despair or doubt, he is calling you to return to him, to trust in him, to lay down your burden at the foot of the cross, and to receive his grace. The same grace that built a wall of water is the same grace that can forgive every sin, heal every wound, and break every chain. Do not harden your heart. Do not wait until the water is at your chin. He is offering you rescue today. And please, I beg you, subscribe to this channel and share my story. This is not for me. This is for the countless others who are still in their own tunnels, waiting for a miracle. Your subscription, your share, is not just a click, it is an act of witness. It is a declaration that these stories must be told, that the echoes of God's return must reach every corner of the earth, from the tallest skyscrapers in America to the most remote villages in Asia. Let this story be the ripple that turns into a wave. Let this echo of return become a roar. Subscribe now